Hello and welcome to Business Matters. I'm Roger Hearing. Coming up on the programme today, Canada's government in crisis over allegations that illegitimate pressure was brought onto prosecutors to avoid taking one of the country's largest companies to court. And I'll be joined throughout the programme by two guests on opposite sides of the Pacific. Simon Littlewood, president of AC Growth Delivered, who's joining us from Singapore. So, Simon, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Roger. How are you today?
I'm very well, and all the better for knowing that you're there. And across the other side of the world, Varshini Prakash, co-founder and executive director of Sunrise, which is a movement of young people working to stop climate change, who's joining us live on the line from Boston. So, Varshini, a very good evening to you.
Hi, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good to have you with us as well. Well, let's start a little bit north of where you are, Canada. Now, that's a country not used to being in the global headlines for stories about corruption or bribery. But a series of resignations from the government of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau have caused a major crisis. And the latest opinion polls suggest Canadians are losing faith in the man who was seen as one of the brightest new hopes of the Liberal left. And he could even lose the general election in October. The opposition Conservatives have drawn ahead of his Liberal Party for the first time. Now, the crisis all centres on a construction firm, one of the biggest companies in Canada, which is called SNC-Lavalin. It's been claimed the company bribed officials in Libya, and Trudeau's government then put illegitimate pressure on prosecutors not to take the company to court. Well, I spoke to Robert Fife, who's Ottawa bureau chief of the Globe and Mail newspaper. So, after these latest opinion numbers, will Justin Trudeau survive as Prime Minister?
Certainly the government has taken a pretty big hit. It's one of these stories that are outside the Ottawa bubble that's now on the streets, and Liberal MPs who are gone back to the ridings because there was a parliamentary break are all reporting that they are getting an earful from constituents. But I'm not sure that it's enough that would to result yet in the government's defeat, because an election is not until October. There's plenty of time for the government to recover and face the electorate and possibly win another majority government. But the government is in deep trouble, and we're starting to see from the Prime Minister's office that maybe he's going to show some contrition. He just recalled Canada's ambassador to the United States, David McNaughton, who ran the Liberal election campaign in 2015. He's a very shrewd political operative. And we're now hearing out of the Prime Minister's office that perhaps the Prime Minister will come out and say this whole thing should have been handled differently, and he regrets it.
It seems very strange to someone observing from outside, because Justin Trudeau image internationally is one of very, very clean government, very open, very not being in the hall of big business or anything like that. And yet he seems to have, or the allegation is at least, that he brought undue pressure on behalf of this company.
People in the world should realize that he is the first Prime Minister who was found by our Ethics Commissioner to have violated the Ethics Act for accepting luxury vacation at the Bahamas retreat of the Aga Khan. So he's not squeaky clean. But clearly on this particular issue, this is much more serious. SNC-Lavalin, which is a large engineering and construction company, is well connected to the Liberal Party. A few years ago, it pled guilty for funneling $100,000 in cash to the Liberal Party. And what we saw was behind-the-scene efforts to lean on the Attorney General to cut a break for SNC-Lavalin, to give it a deferred prosecution without trial. She rejected it, and they kept pressuring and pressuring her and pressuring her. And when she refused the Prime Minister's pressure tactics, he removed her from cabinet and reduced and demoted her to Veterans Affairs and put up, guess what, a Montreal MP in as Justice Minister, somebody who would be much more favorable to SNC-Lavalin. It stinks, and people in the country can see clearly what's going on here, and that's why the Prime Minister is in trouble.
And also, again, I mean, one thing that strikes an outsider, these are two fairly senior women who've resigned, one of them with Indigenous background, and these two communities that Justin Trudeau's been trying to appeal to.
There are three things here. One is the ethical issue. He promised to do things differently, and obviously he hasn't by political interference in a criminal prosecution. The other is reconciliation with Canada's First Nations. Miss Wilson-Raybould, who was the Attorney General and Justice Minister, was the first Indigenous person to ever hold that job, and she has now resigned on principle, and so it's fractured the confidence of the Indigenous community in this country. It's really undermined a lot of the so-called virtues of the Prime Minister that a lot of Canadians were attracted.
And at the core of it is this case against the company, that the company paid bribes in Libya. And again, many people in the outside world would think that Canadian companies are less likely to do that than many other companies because of quite high ethical standards. So is that also not true?
Problem with SNC-Lavalin is it's got a pretty bad history of criminal wrongdoing. It was banned for 10 years from the World Bank for bribery and fraud in Africa in terms of contracts, and now you have they have the same issue here in Libya. In fact, they were buying hookers for the Gaddafi sons in Canada, and they were going to buy a yacht for the Gaddafi boys. So, yes, a lot of Canadian companies are pretty much up on the up, but SNC-Lavalin has had a bad reputation for quite a number of years. And this is another reason why, even though they've gotten rid of the bad actors and they've promised to be good boys, a lot of people out there in Canadian society are saying, look, a small business person or ordinary person, they wouldn't get a break like this. They'd be going to jail. And it's because SNC-Lavalin is so politically connected. One of the directors are on the Trudeau Foundation, which was set up by his father. The chairman of the board is a former clerk of the Privy Council who appointed the current clerk of the Privy Council. Canada is a very small country with a very small corporate elite, and they're all interconnected, it seems. They didn't count on an Indigenous woman from Vancouver, Jody Wilson-Raybould, saying, no, I'm not going to put up with this, and I will not sell out my principles for this government.
Robert Fife of the Globe and Mail newspaper. Farshini, it's not the image of Justin Trudeau that we're used to, is it?
No, it isn't. And I just want to salute. I mean, it's quite a brave stance that those two women took. And it also shows why we need principled people in office who are accountable to the constituents they claim to represent. Obviously, the discussion of corruption in government is paramount in the United States, with the Trump administration being called by some historians as the most corrupt presidency since Warren Harding's in the 1920s. And the litany of corruption charges, lawsuits, allegations, etc., is endless. And I can say here, people are quite sick of the corruption as well. And I think one of the sort of stars in the night remain the record number of women and people of color and queer folks who have run and won office over the last few years in direct response to the corruption we've seen in some of these governments.
Simon, it's one of the lessons, I suppose, that any government in the end can have this shadow of suspicion about corruption, if nothing else.
Well, the thing about Trudeau, he's made such a thing about being so virtuous. I mean, that's his main stock in trade. He doesn't have any real political experience. He was a school drama teacher, I think. He's traded entirely on the back of his father, Pierre Trudeau, who was an absolute rock star in the 60s and 70s. And I mean that literally. He would hang out with the Jaggers and so on and so forth. So he was immensely popular. And what this seems to have exposed is the fact that it's all a bit implausible and thin. When it comes right down to it, it's business as usual. And by the way, business as usual in the sense that business is connected with politics, as it is everywhere. I don't think what's been alleged to have been going on is that unusual. It's just completely at odds.
So it's a bit naive, really, in the first place, to believe the spin.
Well, I think that's right. Now, I listened to every word of Justin Robles' testimony, and it was extremely compelling, as much as anything from what she did not say as what she did say. She was extremely measured and extremely professional. And I think in many ways that made it all the more damaging. It's very clear that she was furious at the way that she had been treated, because I think she genuinely took what she did seriously and she genuinely cared,
Well, there we are. I'm sure that story will unravel a bit further, and we'll see what happens in the election in October.